There's a lot of optimism for Utah fans this year, and rightfully so. Should be a good football team, but I wonder what the optimism should be for the Pac-12 overall. I wonder what national expectations are, because the North looks pretty deep. The South looks top-heavy. I mean, what happens if the Pac-12 misses out on the playoff again? I wonder if there is a real need for the Pac-12 to make the playoff every few years, or if it's more about just if you're in the dance, that's all that matters, and you'll find a partner later.
Let's welcome our next guest. You can find him on Twitter at Jack Follman. You can read him at PacificTakes.com, where he covers the Pac-12. It is Jack Follman. Jack, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Jack.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Well, how optimistic are you overall about the Pac-12 this year, Jack? Do you feel like they've got a chance to be a playoff team this year?
I don't think so. I think the conference is really, which has been the problem with the conference in recent years, it's very strong in the middle, in that upper middle, but they lack an elite team, the kind of team that I think that can go toe-to-toe with Alabama, Clemson, Oklahoma, Ohio State. They have a lot of teams that I think are going to be ranked somewhere between like 11 and 25, but they lack that team that's elite, that should be a preseason playoff, favorite or contender.
Jack, then looking at the Pac-12, which games you think are going to be the most important for keeping the Pac-12 in that conversation? Does Stanford, Northwestern, does that matter at all nationally, or is it the two Notre Dame games, and is it Oregon-Auburn early in the season?
I think Oregon-Auburn is the number one game where, Stanford's kind of a team that plays Notre Dame every year. It kind of always gives the conference a ruler, but for some reason it always seems to be an afterthought. I think maybe because it's always in October or November. People really seem to focus on those early games when we're all itching for football, and people are really excited to see, a powerhouse from one conference take on the other one. And this year, that's going to be that Oregon-Auburn game, two teams that are trying to sneak into the playoff conversation, and whoever wins will be, and whoever loses won't be. And it'll be a huge chance, not just for Oregon, but for the Pac-12 to make a statement if the Ducks can go down there with Justin Herbert and get a signature win right in the opening week of the season against, not an SEC powerhouse this year, but a very good SEC team.
It feels like Washington's got a little more favorable schedule than Oregon. Oregon's got a more proven quarterback, obviously, but there's a case to be made for both those teams, certainly in the North. Which side do you fall on, Jack? Which do you feel like Oregon or Washington's the best team in the North?
Yeah, I think so much more of college football comes down to schedule than people realize, unless you're Clemson or Alabama in a lot of years. And Washington, I think, getting Oregon at home, and that's going to be huge for them. And the Ducks having to go at Washington and at Stanford. To me, Oregon and Washington are like a coin toss. And if it's a coin toss to me, I'll go with the team that in the head-to-head matchup has the home game. So for me, I'll give Washington the slightest of edges, and we'll see how it goes in October. That's going to be a huge game for those programs.
Jack Follman's our guest, ESPN 700. What do you think is the best selling point for the Pac-12 this year? Is there a name? Is there a team? Is there a game? What is it?
I think it has to be, for better or worse, that strength of the middle of the conference. When we go up to even an SEC or a Big Ten, they have some of those. I throw the Big 12 in there as well. You have those big one or two teams. I definitely throw the ACC in there. The conference has one really great team, but then really no one else. The Pac-12 is deep. It's not a conference like the ACC that has Clemson and everyone else is just fighting for second place. There's probably 5 or 6 teams that I think could win the conference realistically, and teams that could go and play mid-level, upper mid-level teams from the other conferences and be really good to me. So it's top to bottom. It's strong. That's what the Pac-12 has right now. For better or worse, parity, which also unfortunately means when we get to the conference schedule, as we've had in the past recent years, we're going to have teams, Washington State knockoff teams, that might be a playoff contender, and Stanford sneak up on people as we go along the season. So parity and strength of the middle is what the Pac-12 has this year.
Well, speaking of parity, I see a lot of similarities with Arizona and Arizona State. Some question marks defensively for both teams, but it's hard to find. Most projections have them both making a bowl game, maybe approximately 6 or 7 win teams. What's your optimism on either Arizona or Arizona State, Jack?
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. I think, the preseason prognosticators are pretty good on the state of Arizona. I could see it coming down to the Territorial Cup to see which team makes the bowl this year. I think Arizona State's got to break in a new quarterback. Arizona's set at quarterback with Khalil Payton, has some nice pieces in the offense, but as per usual, Arizona's a major question mark in the trenches. So they both have their question marks. They both have, solid but not absolutely remarkable coaches and staffs that are getting their second year, getting some footing. And I would be very shocked if either of those teams even makes really a run at the South Crown, let alone the Pac-12 crown. But I would also be pretty shocked if either of those teams, only wins 2 or 3 games. I think they're pretty well settled in the middle of the conference.
Talking the Pac-12 with Jack Follman, ESPN 700. It does seem like there's 2 teams in the North every year that somehow get overlooked, and all they do is win 8 to 10 games, and that's Stanford and Washington State. Both have a lot of turnover this year, both losing some stars from the last few seasons. What do you expect to see from those 2 schools?
Stanford's my wild card team. I think you'd have to go back to 2013, maybe even 2011, the last time Stanford, with the Pac-12 scheduling, Stanford gets a flip-flop where they get Washington and Oregon at home every other year, and they get them both on the road every year. In the past few years, they've had both those teams at home. Stanford's won the North. So I really like what they have at KJ Costello at quarterback too. Arguably he was better than Justin Herbert last year, and he's got a lot of NFL intangibles as well. Stanford just has to replace 2 huge pieces on offense, and Bryce Love and J.J. Arcega-Whiteside. And that's easier said than done, even though they have some nice candidates. And their offensive line and defense needs to get back to the old Stanford days to do that. Washington State, in short, we all keep doubting them every year, but Mike Leach has just continued to churn it out, the 8 to 9 to 10 win seasons, and it doesn't seem to matter who's at quarterback as they replace Luke Falk with Gardner Minshew, and now it looks like they're going to get another grad transfer. And they have nice pieces at receiver on their offensive line, and their defense year after year is maybe the most underrated in the Pac-12. So they're going to be right in it again. I wouldn't predict them to win the North, but they'll be in it probably to the Apple Cup.
Colorado started 5-0 last year. They lost 7 in a row, which they've done that. You can't do that more than once in a few year span, or you got to move on from a coach. It's just there's too much quit factor there. But Colorado's schedule doesn't get much easier after their first 5 games this year again. Could Laviska Shenault single-handedly do enough to put that team into a bowl game this year under Mel Tucker?
He could. I think Colorado has enough nice pieces, not just Shenault, to sneak up on some teams and win some games, but I wouldn't see it happening. I think they don't play Oregon State, which does not help their cause, which is probably, to me, the only team in the Pac-12 that I would say Colorado is definitely most likely better than. It's going to be tough. Shenault, too, also has to stay healthy. The big reason why they dropped all those games on the stretch is he got hurt, and then they really didn't have much else on offense. And overall, talent-wise, they don't really stack up with the better teams in the conference. The Utahs, the Washingtons, the Oregons, the Stanfords. So they have a lot to prove.
Jack Follman's our guest, ESPN 700. So looking at some of the non-conference games, you look at a Northwestern, you look at a Notre Dame that USC and Stanford both have a chance to play. What do those mean? And we've seen USC now shift, and they're willing to go to FCS schools now and stop playing those major schools. Are we going to see less value placed on those for the Pac-12 with the goal of just having better records overall?
That seems to be what I see happening in college football. Like, you look at Alabama's non-conference schedule. I think the toughest team they play is Duke at a neutral venue. I think people kind of really valued those games, but then as time has started to go on, people have started to kind of devalue them and, take care of business in your conference and don't get yourself banged up in one of those games and knock yourself out in, week 1 or 2 or 3. And you probably have a better shot. I think the last Pac-12 team that made it to the playoff was Washington, and they didn't play a tough non-conference schedule. So they got to practice a lot. They got healthy early in the season and had a good conference run. Whereas last year, Washington took on Auburn and Atlanta, and I think they got really banged up, and it showed later in the season when, you play a Super Bowl, a playoff style game in week 1, you better have some time to bounce back from that and hopefully limit your guys' reps enough to where you aren't banged up in a few weeks when you have to go play a Cal or a Stanford or a USC.
Freshmen have always wanted to show up and play right away, but it feels like now with the transfer portal making it so much easier for guys to transfer that they're almost able to threaten schools and hold schools ransom. Do you get that sense that it's in the modern era there's more pressure to play these freshmen than ever before?
Yeah, it's I think it's become like the wild, wild west all across the country and not just out west. And it's picking up out here in the Pac-12 where it started kind of with quarterbacks, which seems pretty legitimate. I mean, if you're a quarterback and it becomes pretty clear after a year or two that you're not going to be the starter there, why not go somewhere where you might be able to start because you only have one starter? But now it seems like every position, if a player's not, starting or getting a ton of reps by his second year, that you kind of assume that player is going to be gone, especially if he's a decent rated recruit. And it's going to be wild and it's going to be interesting, especially now that we have these inter-conference transfers where you have, not only do you have to worry about keeping a guy on your team, you have to worry that he's not going to go to your rival in a year or two, and suddenly you're going to have to be going against a player that you recruited a couple of years ago. It's pretty strange.
Jack, pretty standard. You look at quarterback rankings in the Pac-12. Basically, everybody has Justin Herbert, Jacob Eason potentially jumping in from Washington, Tyler Huntley, and KJ Costello. It's kind of the four guys. Who could break into that list, or who's going to be the breakout quarterback in the Pac-12 of those expected top 4 or 5 players?
Yeah, Gage Gabrud, if he wins the job at Washington State, he's the guy you got to watch because it really just seems like now, after all those years at Texas Tech and now at Washington State, where Mike Leach knows how to bring in a quarterback, and whoever is going to start there is going to put up numbers and play really well in that scheme. So he's the guy I think to watch. I mean, he's kind of like Gardner Minshew before him. You would be shocked if he's regarded as the best quarterback in the conference over some guys who might have more NFL potential or who have more hype going into the season like Herbert or Eason.
What's the best case and worst case scenario, in your opinion, for USC football this year?
Oh, USC is I kind of can't believe we've gotten to this point with USC where I look at their roster and usually I would say even on a down year with USC when Sarkisian or Lane Kiffin was the coach, I would still say USC can play with anyone in the country, but they just don't have the talent that they used to. I think the best case scenario for USC is they win the South. They're going to have to get some breaks to do that, and they get a shot at whoever wins the North. And they creep to a Rose Bowl with 2 or 3 losses. I think that's the best case. Worst case scenario, USC. I can't believe this could win 3 or 4 games, especially considering they have a very tough non-conference schedule. They aren't going to get an automatic 3 wins like a lot of teams who are struggling the way they are do. USC could have one of their worst seasons that they've ever had. There's a lot could go wrong there.
Is there a quick fix? I mean, is Urban Meyer a quick fix, or are the problems deeper than that?
I think they're deeper than that. I think what you're seeing right now, too, is especially concerning recruiting, is Oregon and Washington are throwing Stanford as well, are mopping the floor with USC and recruiting on the West Coast and in Southern California, which is insanity. And that's the kind of stuff that it's been going on for a few years now, and that's the kind of stuff that shows up down the road. So even if you bring in an Urban Meyer, who obviously is a guy who can turn things around really quickly, it's going to be tough. And I don't think USC's maintained the way Ohio State had, their talent levels the way Ohio State had when he came in. So it's not only going to take a really good coach, it might take a really good coach in a couple of years to really get things turned around for USC. It's that dire for them.